Within the Hunkpapa, Chief Gall was known as both a fighter and an advisor. He had lived 36 years, was wide-framed, dignified, and serene, possessing the vigilant gaze of one who had witnessed enough conflict to never take a foe lightly. In combat, he had shown himself to be without fear. In deliberation, he was prudent. His tribe had faith in him because he conducted himself as a man aware of the price of every choice. He had gained that esteem through injury and loss. As a younger man, he had headed war parties against opposing nations, and later against the advancing U.S. military. His skill and courage established him as one of the most daunting warriors of the Hunkpapa, to the extent that Sitting Bull, the Sioux's holy man, had taken Gaul as his sibling. Collectively, they embodied the dual pillars of Lakota authority: Sitting Bull, the foresight and belief; Gaul, the weapon and protector. And presently, in the summer of 1876, the rumble of American war drums resounded once more over the land. News had arrived in the villages that troops were approaching, blue-uniformed horsemen led by a fair-haired commander, the Lakota called Long Hair, George Armstrong Custer. He was a figure known for his overconfidence and boldness, a celebrated cavalry officer from the Civil War who now desired a final conquest over the prairie tribes. Custer was convinced the operation would be quick, an opportunity to break the opposition, seize Sitting Bull, and secure his legacy. But Gaul and his people understood the truth. The Sioux, the Cheyenne, and their partners had assembled in larger forces than previously, more than 2,000 fighting men strong, and they were not fleeing. They were prepared. Even so, when lookouts reported that troops were near, the village was taken by surprise. It was the early hours of June 25th when Lakota riders observed a line of soldiers advancing through the far-off hills. Their arrival sent a wave of alarm through the camp. Mothers drew their children near. Fighters grasped for their arms. On the horizon, a signal fire smoldered on a low bluff, a message from the scouts. The soldiers were near, much nearer than anyone had understood. Custer's advance had been shrewd. He had split his 7th Cavalry into 3 distinct units, Major Marcus Reno leading 3 troops to hit the camp's southern edge, Captain Frederick Benteen with another 3 to press from the west, and Custer personally commanding 5 troops to the north, planning to attack from the high ground and squeeze the village from both sides. To Custer, this was a masterful move, a classic enveloping action that would corner his adversary. But to Gaul, it was the hubris of a man who failed to comprehend what he was entering. Initially, Sitting Bull's council argued over whether to run or make a stand. Tradition counseled care, to safeguard the families above all. But the moment for withdrawal had passed. The soldiers were already fording the stream. Gaul would later recall the first gunshots tearing through the village, the report of carbines, the cries of women and children fleeing in terror. He raced toward the noise, his heart hammering. Smoke and dirt clouded the sky. Horses whinnied. In moments, the tranquil morning had shattered into bedlam. Reno's force, 150 strong, had galloped over the river, pushing directly at the southern tip of the village. Their rounds ripped through the teepees. Gaul's own home was one of the first hits. He dashed toward it, but he was not in time. His 2 wives and 3 children lay still upon the churned ground, felled in the initial salvo. Whether they died by accidental shots or targeted fire, Gaul could not say. He only knew his life had shattered in that moment. Later, when questioned about that day, Gaul stated softly, "They were killed there by the pale-faced warriors." It made my heart bad. In the Lakota tongue, that phrase, "my heart was bad," held a gravity no English term could convey. It signified a sorrow so profound it ignited into fury. It signified retribution. It signified that there was no path back. From that instant, Gaul fought not for honor, not for tactics, but for payback. After that, he said, "I killed all my enemies with the hatchet." It was a Lakota saying, a pledge to forsake the gun and engage in merciless hand-to-hand fighting. The tide of the battle swiftly turned against Reno. The Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, hundreds strong, leaped onto their ponies and streamed across the plains like a tempest of living fury. Gaul commanded his band of fighters directly into the core of the struggle. Reno's troops had taken positions in the trees by the riverbank, setting up a defensive line. They discharged round after round, but their line crumbled under the ferocious assault. Fighters assailed them from all sides, shooting, advancing, wheeling about, using the landscape for concealment. And though the name of Sitting Bull would be eternally linked to this fight, he did not take up arms that day. He stayed in the camp, conducting holy ceremonies, what the warriors referred to as making medicine, offering prayers and calling upon the spirits for their aid. Out on the plains, Gaul and a second chief, Crazy Horse, directed the turmoil. They synchronized their assaults with an almost preternatural accuracy, one surge of horsemen pressing the soldiers into withdrawal, a second group blocking their escape. The 7th Cavalry's formation shattered, and Reno's troops ran in disarray. Through the haze and the yelling, one man drew Gaul's notice. Bloody Knife, a scout of mixed Arikara and Hunkpapa heritage who rode with Major Reno. Bloody Knife had previously dwelled with Gaul's band, but had later opposed them, working as a guide for the U.S. Army. In Gaul's eyes, he was a turncoat, a man for whom kinship held no meaning. As Reno yelled commands next to him, a round smashed through Bloody Knife's head. Gore and bone fragments sprayed over the major's face. Reno stood paralyzed with shock. In that moment, his nerve deserted him. He called for a full retreat, a frantic rush back over the river under intense fire. Gaul observed as mayhem overtook them. Troopers freed their mounts, struggled through the water, lost their footing, tumbled and were pulled under by the flow. Sioux fighters pursued them, striking them down in the river shallows, hitting them with war clubs and spears. Many perished before they could attain the opposite shore. By the time the remnants of Reno's command scrambled to the safety of a bluff, 32 of their number were lost and their leader was shattered. Gaul wished to destroy them completely right then. But as he rallied his men, a fresh warning spread among the fighters. A different column of troops had been seen to the north, Custer's own detachment. Gaul's rage intensified. He had watched Reno's force crumble and flee. Now he would confront the man who had caused his family's slaughter. He assembled a group of warriors and galloped northward. The earth shook under their ponies' feet as they reached the high ground overlooking the Little Bighorn. From that vantage, Gaul could observe the great expanse of the river basin, the tipis below, the smoke still climbing, and to the north the cloud of dust from Custer's nearing troops. What Gaul witnessed next contradicted all his assumptions. Custer's soldiers were not thundering into the village as he had expected. They were halting, pausing, reforming their ranks on the ridges, as if unsure of their own plan. Gaul would later recount that one horseman, positioned separately with binoculars lifted, held his gaze. His hair was shorter than in the stories, cut short for the expedition, so Gaul did not identify him immediately. Only afterwards did he understand that this was Longhair in person, George Armstrong Custer. He seemed no different from any other soldier, Gaul remembered. We did not realize it was him. Custer had stopped to assess the situation, perhaps feeling the snare he was about to enter. Beneath him the village extended for miles, swarming with combatants. The sun glinted off gunmetal and lance points. For a protracted minute, Custer appeared immobilized. Then Gaul issued the command, and the warriors attacked. That was how Gaul recalled it, not Custer assaulting the Sioux, but the Sioux assaulting Custer. If his account was correct, it meant that Custer's final battle was not a deed of rash boldness, but a frantic reaction against a foe already on the offensive. Other observers would later give conflicting reports, some maintaining that Custer struck first, others that the clash started at nearly the same time. But for Gaul, the recollection was certain. He had witnessed the terror in the soldiers' faces as they comprehended what they were facing, and so commenced the real clash at the Little Bighorn, a struggle that would become one of the most brutal and incorrectly portrayed encounters in American history. As Gaul urged his horse over the crest, the atmosphere was dense with powdered earth and the scent of burnt powder. Below him, the ridges unfolded like swells on a sea, their green slopes already strewn with the corpses of Custer's troopers. The drumming of hooves reverberated from the hills, Sioux and Cheyenne warriors galloping to encircle the approaching cavalry. Initially, Custer's deployment appeared orderly. His men advanced in disciplined columns, the yellow scarves of the 7th Cavalry waving in the washed-out sky. They were armed with Springfield carbines, potent but cumbersome to reload, and Colt pistols for fighting at close quarters. But the land itself worked against them. The hills disrupted their fields of fire. The grass stood high, and the warriors flowed like mist, unable to be targeted. Gaul and his band of fighters tracked the soldiers from the eastern side, remaining just beyond the reach of their rifles. He could see Custer's men looking about uneasily, conscious they were being observed. Then as they topped a rise, a tide of riders exploded from the gully beneath them. Hundreds of Sioux and Cheyenne fighters, their war cries rising above the din of the shooting. The initial barrage ripped into Custer's side. Horses collapsed, men fell, and the orderly lines dissolved in moments. Custer's units attempted to turn and establish a defensive position, but the warriors were already in their midst, shooting from their ponies, then leaping down to fire again from concealment. Gaul's men advanced with lethal intent. They had known for years not to confront cavalry directly. Instead, they struck in concentrated groups, wheeling around, hitting the sides, baiting their fire, and converging from all angles. For every trooper they felled, two more lost their nerve. The soldiers' carbines, the very Springfield models Custer had demanded for the campaign, started to malfunction. The residue from the black powder clogged the mechanisms under continuous use. Gaul observed as soldiers wrestled with their jammed guns, swore, and grabbed for their pistols. But the sidearms were nearly useless against the wave of warriors surging toward them. Some troopers retreated, discharging their weapons wildly as they fled. Others abandoned their rifles completely, attempting to make a stand with fixed bayonets. It was a picture of escalating bedlam, filled with cries, gun smoke, and the thunder of hooves. Gaul remembered it as a haze of rage and disarray. He could see Custer's force splintering into smaller clusters, attempting to reform on the higher bluffs. One band of soldiers made a final defense along a rise later known as Battle Ridge. Another, smaller group, maybe 30 men, withdrew toward a nearby hill that would afterwards carry Custer's name. Custer himself was somewhere in that fray. Gaul never stated he witnessed his death. In truth, he declined to say which warrior killed the man the world would know as the fallen legend of the West. "We did not know it was him," he repeated over and over. "He was just like all the others." But Gaul saw sufficient evidence to understand that Custer's force had been shattered before it could ever unite for a coherent battle. By the time Gaul arrived at the ridge, the ground was littered with shattered carbines, downed horses, and corpses contorted in the deep grass. The soldiers were battling in isolated groups, firing until their final rounds were spent. The Sioux and Cheyenne closed in ever tighter, their shouts resonating through the river valley. Gaul saw one set of cavalrymen, likely from Company L, making a final stand near the bottom of a hill. They fought side by side, composed even as the ring around them constricted. Their commander, Lieutenant James Calhoun, who was Custer's own brother-in-law, stood at the center, directing their volleys with the calm resolve of a man who accepted his fate. "Those men fought strong," Gaul would later state, "but it did not save them." The soldiers fired until their carbines were empty. When they had no more bullets, the warriors overran them, covering the final distance in a hail of arrows, gunfire, and battle cries. The combat became a brutal melee, knives against bayonets, hatchets against pistols. At almost the same time, Captain Miles Keogh's company was striving to reach Calhoun's position. Gaul watched them fighting their way up the incline, shooting as they advanced, only to be met by a flood of warriors charging down the slope. Keogh's mount was shot from under him, and his formation ruptured. When the smoke settled, Keogh's men lay dead where they had fought, their bodies discovered later in a tight group, still holding their formation. Higher on the ridge, Custer's personal contingent, Companies C, E, and F, continued to resist near the top. Gaul rode toward the haze and witnessed the conclusion from afar. A few men discharging their last shots, some attempting to protect the injured, others loading their weapons one last time before being overrun. And then, it finished. The rifle fire dwindled. The warriors ceased their shooting. The only noises that remained were the groans of the mortally wounded and the agitated shifting of the horses. The final struggle of the 7th Cavalry had been extinguished. It had lasted little more than an hour. Afterwards, when the U.S. Army returned to the field, they would discover the corpses scattered in groups over the hills, a path of the dead extending from the river to the high ground. Custer was among them, struck in the side and the head, relieved of his clothes. The remains of his brothers Tom and Boston and his young nephew Audie Reed lay close by. For the Sioux, their defeat was no puzzle. They had battled with courage, it was true, but also with folly. They had divided their command, misjudged their opposition, and marched naively into an ambush they had failed to anticipate. Gall's part in that battle was that of both a leader and an observer. He had fought with revenge as his motive, but he had also perceived the sorrow of it, the loss, the pointlessness. The soldiers were not anonymous foes to him. They were men entangled in a conflict whose nature escaped them. Even so, he felt no mercy. His heart remained bad, and his anger was not spent. Following Custer's fall, Gall turned his pony south, resolved to complete the day's work. Reno's survivors, the ones who had avoided the initial charge, remained entrenched on the bluffs above the river. They were injured, terrified, and hoping for rescue troops that had not come. Gall intended to destroy them. The Sioux and Cheyenne assembled again for the assault. Crazy Horse rode with them, his mere presence energizing the fighters. Together they swept toward Reno's fortified hill. Rounds whistled past, dirt and smoke obscured the hillside. But Reno and his men had constructed solid defenses. Their location was advantageous, their supply of bullets ample. For hours, successive waves of warriors assailed the hill, only to be repelled by controlled gunfire. As daylight started to fade, Gall withdrew and assessed the situation. He understood a reality that eluded most in the fury of the fight. Reno's post could not be overrun without severe casualties. The soldiers were well fortified behind earthworks, their horses forming a protective barrier. To assault them directly would be to invite destruction. So Gall adapted his approach. He commanded his warriors to surround the hill and maintain steady pressure, not to attack head-on, but to wear them down, to fatigue them, to cut them off. Throughout the endless night, the Sioux and Cheyenne shot into the American lines, targeting any sign of life, ensuring the troopers remained alert and terrified. No one rose to their feet. No one rested. The moans of the injured carried through the blackness. They will fall into our hands when the thirst burns in their throats and drives them mad for water, Gall informed his men. By dawn, his prediction was almost realized. The sun climbed, harsh and pitiless, scorching the men on Reno Hill. Their water was gone, their mouths were parched. The wounded pleaded for a drink, but the gully leading to the river was covered by sniper fire. Any man who tried to crawl down for water faced almost certain death. A number of soldiers attempted it regardless, moving on their stomachs, clutching their canteens, advancing slowly under a shower of bullets. A few returned, many did not. Only in the subsequent Army reports, with medals awarded for courage, would those who fetched water under fire be remembered as heroes. But to Gall and his warriors, it was merely the ongoing fight, a contest of endurance between two forces who would not surrender. The blockade continued for almost 2 full days. Then on the afternoon of June 26th, lookouts saw a dust cloud forming far away, a great smear darkening the skyline. Gall named it the Big Dust. At first, its meaning was unclear. Then the realization came. It was the primary Army force, commanded by General Alfred Terry and General John Gibbon, progressing to join Custer's command. The relief column was here. Gall knew what this required. Sitting Bull sent instructions through the encampment. The moment to leave had arrived. As the sun descended on the Little Bighorn, the Sioux and Cheyenne prepared to depart. Teepee were taken down, travois were packed, and the immense village started its journey, thousands of people melting away into the western hills. The warriors stayed only long enough to gather guns, cartridges, and ponies from the battleground. By dark, the valley was still. When Terry's column reached the site the next day, they found nothing but ruin. The remains of Custer and his command were strewn across the high ground, robbed of their possessions and exposed to the elements. The earth was scorched, and the Sioux and Cheyenne had disappeared, melted into the vast landscape like apparitions. For the American people, the report was a profound shock. The press named it Custer's Last Stand, a story of heroic sacrifice, a martyrdom of frontier courage. But for the Sioux, it was a different matter altogether, a triumph secured by bloodshed, a necessary protection of their people and their homes. For Gall, it was both a success and a sorrow. He had exacted vengeance for his family, yet at a cost that could never be fully redeemed. When the haze dissipated and the sounds of combat died away, a deep quiet settled over the river basin, and within that quiet, Gaul would bear the recollection for all his days, the day the 7th Cavalry was utterly destroyed on the Montana prairie. The gun smoke from the Little Bighorn had long vanished before the memory of the fighting faded from Gaul's mind. In the time following the battle, the enormous gathering of Sioux and Cheyenne families loaded their travois, took down their lodges, and disappeared into the untamed lands north of the Yellowstone. The win was absolute, yet Gaul understood the consequence. The United States would not relent. The soldiers would return in greater numbers than anyone could yet conceive. Gaul rode at the front of his people, quiet, his thoughts burdened by both victory and dread. He had struck back at the force that had killed his wives and children. He had helped shatter the army that believed itself unbeatable. Still, when he observed the endless column of ponies and families trekking over the grass, he felt no happiness. "We killed their soldiers," he would later remark, "but we did not kill their desire for our country." The summer of 1876 ought to have been a time of rejoicing. Instead, it became the start of their decline. Across the nation, the story of Custer's defeat inspired both fear and outrage. Lines of troops marched out from the forts along the Missouri and the Black Hills. Supply wagons lumbered across the plains. Telegraph lines carried the urgent dispatch: "Custer has fallen. Punish the Sioux." Gall, Sitting Bull, and the other chiefs divided their people into smaller groups to evade encirclement. They understood the U.S. Army could not pursue them all simultaneously. For many weeks they existed like phantoms, traveling under darkness, steering clear of known paths, concealing themselves in creek bottoms. Yet the call of the cavalry bugles was always close. The success at the Little Bighorn had transformed the conflict. Previously, the Sioux had battled to preserve their traditions. Now they were pursued as outlaws. One military post after another dispatched forces to subdue them. General Terry, stung by Custer's defeat, advanced with renewed determination. General Crook pushed upward from the south. The trap was closing. During the latter part of the summer, the great bands attempted to gather again near the Yellowstone. Gall and Sitting Bull conferred once more under the wide twilight, circled by the light of council fires. The fighters were agitated. Many wished to engage in another major confrontation. Others counseled retreat. Gall listened and spoke sparingly. He could already perceive the pattern of the future. The white men would not cease until every bison was slaughtered and every home was destroyed. He contended that the nation should travel north, beyond the jurisdiction of the U.S. Army, into the territory of the grandmother, the queen on the other side of the line. Canada. "There we can live free," he stated. "The white man from the north does not wage war upon us." Sitting Bull concurred. In the weeks that came, the difficult exodus commenced. It was a harrowing trek. The plains grew sere and frosty. Sustenance became hard to find. The formerly boundless bison herds had been erased, killed for their skins and for amusement. The children became gaunt, the ponies grew weak, and the nights turned harsh. When they finally passed into Canadian land in the spring of 1877, they were emaciated, but they had survived.